If you lived in Pennsylvania in the 1980s, you experienced a state watching its industrial backbone collapse while trying to figure out what came next. Steel mills were closing, coal mines were shutting down, and factories were laying off thousands. But people today do not understand what Pennsylvania was during that transition. This was still the state of the Steelers dynasty, pierogies and kielbasa on every table, small-town Friday night football under the lights, and winters that tested everyone. Working-class pride and community ties held strong, even as the economy shifted beneath everyone's feet. You remember Primanti Bros sandwiches, Rolling Rock beer, church fundraisers, and neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone. Let's step back into that world. The steel industry that had built Pennsylvania was dying in the 1980s. Pittsburgh's mills were closing one after another. Homestead, once a symbol of American steel production, was shutting down. Bethlehem Steel was declining. Factory towns across western Pennsylvania were watching their main employers disappear. Unemployment rose in communities that had depended on one industry for generations. But Pennsylvanians adapted. People found other work, moved if they had to, or stayed and made it work somehow. Resilience was real. Communities did not fall apart even when the economic foundation crumbled. Working class pride remained strong. Pittsburgh in the 1980s was a city still defined by steel, even as steel was leaving. The mills might be closing, but the identity remained. Three Rivers Stadium was where the Steelers played, and the Steelers were everything. The dynasty of the 1970s was fresh in memory, and the city lived and died with every game. Pittsburgh was a city of neighborhoods. Polish Hill, Squirrel Hill, South Side, each had its own character and ethnic heritage. The neighborhoods were tight-knit. You knew your neighbors. You knew the families who had lived on the block for decades. Primanti Bros served sandwiches piled with coleslaw and fries right on the bread. That was Pittsburgh food. Rolling Rock beer, brewed in Latrobe, was the local choice. The city was defined by its bridges and rivers. The skyline was industrial and beautiful in its own way. Universities like Pitt and Carnegie Mellon were growing, slowly changing the city's economy. But in the 1980s, Pittsburgh was still figuring out what it would become after steel. Philadelphia had its own identity, completely separate from Pittsburgh. The two cities were in the same state, but they felt like different worlds. Philadelphia was struggling with its own economic issues, but the city had a different energy. Row houses lined the streets. Neighborhoods had their own cultures. South Street had bars and music venues. The Italian market was where you bought fresh produce, meats, and imported foods. The Phillies won the World Series in 1980, and the city celebrated like nothing else mattered. The Eagles, the Flyers, and the 76ers all had devoted followings. Sports was identity. Cheesesteaks, hoagies, and soft pretzels from street vendors were Philadelphia food. The move bombing in 1985, when the city dropped explosives on a row house and burned down an entire block, was a dark moment that showed the city's struggles. But Philadelphia was a city of neighborhoods where people had deep roots and strong opinions about everything. Small-town Pennsylvania was where most of the state actually lived. These were towns built around one factory or one coal mine. When that employer struggled or closed, the whole town felt it. But these towns still had their rhythms. Main Street had local businesses, diners, and corner bars. Friday night high school football was the biggest event of the week. The whole town came out to watch. Everyone knew everyone. You could not go to the grocery store without running into people you knew. Diners served breakfast all day, and coffee was always fresh. VFW halls and American legions were where veterans gathered, and communities held events. Hunting was huge. Deer season in late November was treated like a holiday. Schools even closed on the first day of deer season in some areas. The coal region around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre had its own culture shaped by mining history. Lancaster County attracted tourists to see Amish communities and farmland. Rural routes connected farms that were still operating. Corner bars existed in every small town, places where locals gathered after work. Before we continue with the daily life and culture that defined Pennsylvania, if you are enjoying this look back at what the state was really like and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many stories about how Americans lived through the times that shaped us. Living in Pennsylvania meant dealing with weather that shaped your entire year. Winters were harsh. Snow, ice, and gray skies dominated from November through March. Heavy winter coats, boots, and snow shovels were necessities. You kept a scraper and brush in your car. Road salt turned cars to rust. Cars from the 1980s often had rust around the wheel wells. Spring brought mud season when everything thawed and became a mess. Summer was humid and hot. Fall was football season and the best weather of the year. Heating bills in winter were significant expenses that everyone planned for. Snowstorms shut things down regularly. Lake effect snow in northwestern Pennsylvania, near Erie, made winters even more brutal. 4 distinct seasons meant adapting your life 4 times a year. Food in Pennsylvania reflected the state's ethnic heritage. Pierogies, kielbasa, and haluski were staples in households across the state. Pennsylvania Dutch foods like shoofly pie, scrapple, and chow chow represented another cultural thread. Cheesesteaks and hoagies were Philadelphia icons. Pittsburgh had its own sandwich culture, with everything piled high. Yuengling, brewed in Pottsville since 1829, was the local beer of choice and a source of state pride. Church fundraisers featured ethnic foods, with different churches representing different heritages. Fish fries during Lent were community events. Farmers markets sold local produce. Local diners served simple food done right, and were gathering places. Entertainment in Pennsylvania centered around sports and community. High school football on Friday nights was where everyone gathered. The Steelers, the Eagles, the Phillies, and the Flyers were obsessions. Families planned their lives around game schedules. Drive-in theaters were still around in the 1980s. Kennywood Amusement Park outside Pittsburgh dated back to 1898, and it was where families went in summer. Hershey Park attracted visitors. Hunting and fishing were major activities. Bowling leagues were popular. VCRS became common, and renting movies from local video stores became a weekend routine. Local bars were social centers, where regulars had their stools and everyone knew your name. Working life in Pennsylvania in the 1980s was changing. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing, but service sector jobs were growing. Small businesses on Main Street employed locals. Union culture was still strong in many areas. Churches tied communities together. People knew one another through church, work, and family connections that went back generations. Volunteer fire departments were staffed by locals who took pride in serving. High schools were community centers where basketball games and plays brought people together. Many people stayed in their hometowns, but others left for opportunities elsewhere. 3 Mile Island's partial meltdown happened in 1979, but its shadow hung over Pennsylvania through the 1980s. The nuclear accident near Harrisburg created anxiety that lasted. Some people left the area. Most stayed. It was part of Pennsylvania's story in that decade, a reminder that things could go wrong. The 1980s in Pennsylvania meant watching jobs disappear, and young people left for opportunities in other states. The brain drain was real. College graduates often left because the jobs were not there, but communities held together. Family ties were strong. There was pride in being from Pennsylvania, in the work ethic, and in the communities that had been built over generations. Pennsylvania in the 1980s was a state in transition. The industrial era was ending, And what came next was uncertain. But the communities were strong. The neighborhoods had deep roots. The cultural identity was real. The pierogies in kielbasa, the Friday night football games, the harsh winters everyone complained about but endured, the corner bars where everybody knew your name. The cost of living was still affordable. Houses were within reach for working families. For those who lived through it, Pennsylvania meant something. It meant working class pride and resilience. It meant communities that stuck together even when times were hard. That was Pennsylvania when it was figuring out what came after steel.